Alrighty. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum Speaker Podcast Series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. My name is Anaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined by Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, joining us this week to discuss the top events currently going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. If you should wish to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Akhnaf, and good evening from Israel. Earlier today, it was announced that Minister Benny Gantz of the National Union Party would give a press conference at 7:30. This wasn't particularly strange. There are these types of things that go on. Perhaps it was relating to the recent demonstrations, perhaps something related to the war. And the first part of the press conference was pretty normal. It was, calling for unity, attacking or not attacking, but basically coming out against demonstrations about people who are trying to divide the country, referring to people in the government, referring to people on the streets who are causing violence. And it seemed like a relatively uninteresting press conference. And really at the last minute before he took remarks, he landed the bombshell, which really made me sit up and take notice, where Benny Gantz, member of the government, basically called for elections in September, national elections in the middle of a war. It will certainly be in a war in Gaza. We may well be a war elsewhere. But really, it was quite a shock why this suddenly happened now. First of all, let's go to the subject matter that was sent out about the ultra-Orthodox conscription. We talked about it a little bit last week. April 1st, officially the deferments, the mass deferments for the ultra-Orthodox community that basically been since the beginning of the state were ended. The government couldn't find an answer to them that satisfied all parties, and the Supreme Court allowance of the government to find an opportunity to find a solution, that time ran out, and the Attorney General basically said, well, that's it. There's no more time for this. And as of April 1st, there's no more deferments, mass deferments, and those learning institutions, yeshivot, which do not send their students to the army when they're being called up, will receive financial sanctions. That was probably the biggest bombshell. But what actually happened after that? There was a big debate. What's going to happen? What is clear that a lot of the ultra-Orthodox parties started to turn on, a lot of the speakers, the talking heads, the decision makers, opinion shapers started to turn on Netanyahu. They've lost a lot of faith with him over the years, but still the situation has been better with him than anyone else, and they understand that. But we heard criticisms of Netanyahu really across the board, and there were whispers that a deal was struck between the ultra-Orthodox parties and Benny Gantz to hold elections in 6 months. And during that time, the position of the ultra-Orthodox community will not be affected too badly. We'll see how that works out, because as of now, some of their learning institutions simply will not get money at the moment. For a month, that will be fine. Maybe 2 months, that will be fine. But they are certainly concerned about it. There's been, I think even tonight, there's a big, what they call kinus, of rabbinical leaders from the community to try and see how they can deal with that shortfall. But if the rumors about a deal between Gantz and the ultra-Orthodox are true, that would also be a paradigm-shifting moment where perhaps for the first time in something close to a couple of decades, the ultra-Orthodox will leave Netanyahu and find another home on the political spectrum. So the questions are exactly, why did Benny Gantz do that now? Well, first of all, every single poll for a few months has shown Benny Gantz flying high, certainly over his competitor in the center left, center right, of Yair Lapid. and perhaps he got that signal from the ultra-Orthodox. The other thing that perhaps is concerning for Gantz is what I would refer to as the resurrection of Yair Lapid. And what do I mean by that? Is that a few days ago, I think it was Sunday maybe, or maybe last Thursday, I can't remember, there was the first time ever primaries in the Yesh Atid party. Let's not forget the Yesh Atid party was formed by and in the image of Yair Lapid. Yesh Atid is Yair Lapid is Yesh Atid. And his number two, Ben Barak, went up against him in primaries, and everyone thought it was a bit of a show, and Lapid will win by landslides, and they'll congratulate each other, and everyone will move on. But it's a good show for those who have always complained that Yesh Atid is not a democracy and it doesn't have primaries. Remarkably, what actually happened was a big slap in the face for Yair Lapid, because he only won by 29 votes. Now, again, we're not talking about thousands or tens of thousands of voters. We're talking about hundreds, but still, it was much, much closer than anyone predicted, and certainly anyone really thought was possible. But what we have seen since then, to a real blow to Yair Lapid, is we've seen the resurrection of, or the recurrence, or the return of mass demonstrations on the streets of Israel, in Tel Aviv, of Jerusalem. And interestingly, whereas the previous round, before October 7th, obviously, didn't have high-level political leaders, the first mass demonstration invited Yair Lapid to the stage, and really with Benny Gantz in the coalition, Yair Lapid, and with basically a Labour not to speak of, and a Meretz not even in the Knesset, Yair Lapid is probably the darling of the demonstrators from the left against the government at this point. So he really did receive quite a boost. And perhaps Gantz was thinking, okay, he has to do something. On the one hand, he can't leave the government today. That would look bad in the middle of a war with everything going on. But if he gives the government enough time, or the country enough time to digest the fact that we're going to elections, and let's not forget, if there's going to be elections in September, they have to be called during the summer session. Today we're going on the Knesset break. It's quite controversial. Some, like Avigdor Lieberman, said that the Knesset should not go on a break when soldiers are fighting, hostages are still being held. But in the end, they did go on the break. So when they return after the Pesach holiday, but according to the calendar of what Gantz is now suggesting, that is when they'll have to pass a law to disperse the Knesset for elections. Now, does Gantz know something we don't? Perhaps. Has he probably already assured this with at least some possible partners, i.e. the ultra-Orthodox? Very possibly. I would say he probably didn't come out with it unless he found some assurances, because if the summer session ends and there is no law to disperse the Knesset or any way to get to elections, then he's going to have egg on his face, and it will certainly look bad. So these rumors that there's some budding deal between the ultra-Orthodox and Gantz, pulling the ultra-Orthodox away from Netanyahu for the first time, seems that there's a little bit of credence to it. And remarkably, everyone around the world probably thinks that after October 7th, with the war, with the way the war's been managed, that's probably the thing that's going to fell this government. Whereas in the end, it's probably an issue much closer to home, the ultra-Orthodox conscription issue. As I referred to earlier, protests returned to the streets for the first time since October 7th. They started on Saturday night. Interestingly, what there has been is protests about the hostages, that the government should be doing more, usually led by the protest families. Well, one family member of a protester said, we are now calling for an end to our protests, and we're joining, and we're calling everyone to go back to Kaplan, which is the road in Tel Aviv, which became famous or infamous, depending on where you stand on the political spectrum, for the mass demonstrations every single Saturday night. So it's clear that those Kaplan type protests have returned. There was one on Saturday night, another on Sunday night, another on Tuesday in Jerusalem, very close to the Knesset, the Prime Minister's office. Then there was a splinter protest, which protested outside the Prime Minister's residence in the heart of Jerusalem. Remarkably, some of the protesters actually breached the barriers and got very, very close to the Prime Minister's residence. It was put out today that none of the prime minister was not endangered in any way, but it certainly was significant worry, so much so that the head of the Shin Bet was seen walking around the area in the hours during the demonstration or just after. And that provoked a lot of hostility. On one side, they said that's an exaggeration. On the other side, they said, well, why was he just walking around? Wasn't he doing enough to prevent these demonstrations, which were referred to as violent? There were over 100 arrests. But it's clear that the age of restraint due to the war on behalf of the protesters, the Kaplan protesters, and the Achim Leneshek organizations, and those types of parties to these demonstrations, they decided enough is enough, and they're taking to the streets. They're calling for elections. They're calling for the end of Netanyahu. They're calling for greater force to free the hostages at the negotiating table, I should say. But it's clear that we're going back to October 6th, at least as far as the demonstrations are going. It hasn't been a great week for Netanyahu. On the one hand, he had a hernia operation and was in hospital and is now working from home. Some would argue that the demonstrations are actually playing into Netanyahu's hands in so much that they create that cleave in Israeli society that he's able to take advantage of politically, perhaps, where he can basically say, look, these guys want a defeat. They want to give Sinwar, Nasrallah, and the Ayatollahs in Tehran a victory they didn't earn and don't deserve. I'm the best you've got. So on that level, it actually may play quite well into his political future. Another interesting sort of behind closed doors event happened this week. The suspended discussions between the US and Israel on the potential Rafah operation finally happened. It happened online. On the US side, there was the National Security Advisor, there was the Secretary of State Blinken. On the Israel side, I mean, it wasn't just them. Obviously, there was a lot of professionals as well, but it was led by Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer and National Security Advisor for Israel, Tzachi Hanegbi. There were a lot of differences of opinion. Apparently, it was held in a professional manner, but the differences related to timeline. Israel thinks that it can clear Rafah of civilians within 4 weeks and create humanitarian corridors and humanitarian oases, and then be able to go after Hamas much more easily. The Americans think that's far too short. They think it will take at least 4 months. They again stress that they do not recommend going in full force like Israel did in Gaza City and Khan Yunis. They think it should be surrounded. They think that the IDF should go in for more pinpoint operations, trying to take out Hamas terrorists while not harming the civilian population as much as possible. But it's clear that there are major differences. Obviously, the final thing I mentioned today is the assassination early in the week in Damascus, next to the Iranian embassy in Damascus, of the Quds Force Commander Mohammad Reza Zahedi and his deputy, and I think 5 other senior Iranian Revolutionary Guards and Hezbollah officials. This was certainly considered an escalation by the Iranians and their allies, that this would happen in the heart of Damascus. It would happen next to their embassy there. But these are people who are involved on a day-to-day basis with attacking Israel, attacking Israelis abroad, etc., etc. But the question now is, what happens next? There are a lot of people who think that Iran are going to up the ante. In fact, it was just released just before I came on that the IDF is calling up a lot of reserves in the Air Force. There is a threat, and there is talk of a mass infiltration of drones from Iran into Israel. That will be a massive escalation, because we have not seen any attack from Iranian territory itself, not its proxies in Yemen, not its proxies in Lebanon or Syria or Iraq, but from Iranian soil itself. There is talk of some attack drones, a mass attack drone attempt, and that has actually been given credence by the fact that the American intelligence agencies apparently reportedly warned Israel of that very strong possibility. And you had Amos Yadlin, a former leading intelligence individual who said that they wouldn't be surprised if we see for the first time, in response to the killing of the Al-Quds commander, an attack on Israeli soil from Iranian soil. There is a feeling that they have to react. Iran has to react a lot more forcefully. Tomorrow, we should point out, is Quds Day in Tehran, which is a day they celebrate every year, or they look forward to, or aspire, the conquest of Jerusalem, Al-Quds, as they call it, and the destruction of Israel. So there is a feeling that within the next 24, 48 hours, there could be a very unprecedented, perhaps even historic response from Iran directly, maybe through its proxies, maybe not, but one that they feel that they have to up the ante. There's a lot of calls within the hardline establishment in Tehran, but obviously we'll have to wait and see exactly how that plays out. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, very good. Thank you, Ashley. The first question comes from JL, who asks, with all these issues rising to the surface, i.e., Haredi conscription, left-wing demonstrations, etc., is the Israeli public still supporting the army going into Rafah to finish off Hamas, or are they getting distracted by all these issues?
Well, it's yes and no, I would say to that. First of all, well, I've mentioned this a few times in recent weeks. While there is certainly a difference of opinion who should be leading us, what the government should look like, etc., there is, I would say, almost, a very, not almost, a very, very strong majority of Israelis, according to every poll that I've seen from left to right, that they need to go into Rafah because Hamas, the last few battalions are hiding there, and you can't defeat Hamas without finishing it in Rafah. Obviously, there are other pockets of terrorist resistance, other parts of the Strip, but that's really the last holdout. That's possibly where many Hamas leaders are. Almost certainly, that's where many of the hostages are. So, without going to Rafah, Israel will not be able to achieve its main war aim, which is the destruction and defeat of Hamas. It's certainly, Rafah is not necessarily on everyone's lips today. There are many other things which are going on in Israel, which is distracting the population. But it's clear behind the scenes that there is still a will by the Prime Minister, by pretty much across the board in the Israeli Knesset to support an Israeli operation in Rafah, even though obviously there are a lot of other things going on. And what Prime Minister Netanyahu would say, and he is saying and has said, that all of these other things are a distraction from what should be a unified approach against Hamas. That's the line he's promoting. The opposition would say, well, actually, we're able to not only get greater unity, but perhaps even get more breathing room from the international community if we were able to change the leader and change the government.
Thank you. Now, David Levine asks, Netanyahu's initial response to the accidental bombing of the food trucks appeared surprisingly clumsy and insensitive to the American viewer. How is it viewed in Israel?
Well, yeah, I mean, the first person who released it was Netanyahu. I think he was still in hospital after his hernia operation. I think it did catch some people by surprise. Perhaps it should have been the IDF that should have released it. And there was a feeling that, yes, the initial response from different sources, not just Netanyahu, was obviously not well received. I mean, everyone knew it wouldn't be well received, but it was even worse than they thought. So in the middle of the night, the IDF spokesman had to get out a longer statement and talk about some of the initial findings. But certainly the optics of that look terrible. Obviously, it is a great tragedy, and Israel has already said sorry and apologized and looked and are investigating, as many have suggested, into this incident. But they have accepted responsibility. But these things happen in war. I mean, it's been pointed out all day that the Americans have done it, accidentally killed humanitarian officials, have killed people in hospitals before, as the British, as the French, as many, many others in the international arena. This happens, unfortunately, in war. But Israel is brave enough to put up its hand and said this was a terrible error. It was a misidentification of the trucks. and it's looking into try to ensure that it doesn't happen again. But obviously, in the fog of war, these things happen. I mean, Israel killed 3 of its own hostages earlier in the war, again through error, human error, humans err, and especially in the fog of war at night, when there's maybe not the ability to be 100% certain when you're taking on a particular action. So yes, Israel is certainly going to learn from this, is going to investigate this, and it's clear that this is something which is going to be remembered for quite a while, and with a lot of prodding from the international community.
Thank you. We have a question from Adam Perry, who asks, does there come a time when Netanyahu drives Biden to the brink and America withdraws all military and financial support? Is this a genuine prospect?
I don't think so. I don't think there's any situation. In fact, this week, there is an arms deal, a very large, multi-billion-dollar arms deal, F-35 airplanes, military airplanes, which is going to be signed. So no, what I have said in recent weeks is I do not envision a time where America says we're stopping or slowing down or anything like that. But there are pressure points that they can use. They can use bureaucratic excuses. We have to look into this. We have to give it a final green light. It needs to go through another sense of overview, et cetera, which could send messages. And as we get closer to the elections, and again, I think it's very important to look at America's response and many other countries around the world who are, in the midst of elections or in the midst of election campaigns, and look at it through the prism of that. But no, I think America's support for Israel's military action is ironclad or close to ironclad. What Blinken likes to say, Secretary of State Blinken and many others, is we have no problem with what Israel's doing. We have discussions, and we'd like to see how it does it. That's the sort of soundbite that the Americans are using. It's we support Israel's right to defeat Hamas, but the manner of how it's doing it is important. So I think that says it all, and that says that American support will still be there, but they will have questions, they will have challenges, they will look and have deep discussions with Israel exactly how it engages in this war, and as I mentioned earlier, they're constantly trying to advise the Israel on a path which they certainly prefer.
Alrighty, so moving away from the war a bit here, we've got quite a few questions about what's going on in the Knesset. Carrie Hillebrand asks, is there any realistic chance that the sufficient Likud members will be willing to abandon Netanyahu and form a stable coalition with an alternative prime minister?
There is a chance. I've heard it from a number of people in the Knesset, from in the Likud, and those who are following the situation and have friends, in the Likud and elsewhere, that there are sufficient numbers of people who have just had enough of Netanyahu. But there's 2 buts, obviously, whenever you talk about this situation within the Likud. The first is who's going to come out openly and say it, and who are they going to rally around? Those are 2 important elements that need to be finalized before there's any real threat to Netanyahu within the Likud. First of all, they've seen what happens to anyone who tries to challenge Netanyahu. We saw that with Yuli Edelstein last year. He was dumped very low on the list in the Likud primaries, and Bibi certainly likes to send a message to anyone who would challenge him. Second of all, who's going to be that challenger? Who's going to replace him? Who's going to be because whoever replaces Netanyahu will be prime minister. For example, the most popular is economy minister Nir Barkat, but Nir Barkat isn't liked by others. Maybe, let's say, Yisrael Katz, who's the foreign minister, and Miri Regev, who's the transportation minister, and this one doesn't like this one, and this one doesn't. So how are they going to agree on one figure? It is a bit of a divide and rule that Netanyahu has done to make sure that there is no obvious successor. So until they figure out those 2 outstanding issues, Netanyahu is sitting relatively safely. But it could well be that there certainly will be a point. We don't know when, and certainly a lot of people predicted it for many, many years. But what will be the point where it will be enough is enough for a sufficient amount of Likud members to cross the aisle and then support either a replacement of the government, which is possible without elections, or simply just going to elections.
All right. And on a similar note, we have a question from an anonymous attendee who asks, can Lieberman, Bennett, an abstention now, and Eisenkot get enough to put Gantz in office if the Orthodox do support Gantz?
Well, first of all, that would obviously be after elections because Bennett is not sitting in the Knesset out of that list. According to polls, they don't even need the ultra-Orthodox. According to all recent polls, if we had elections tomorrow, there'd be a sufficient government. If you look at all the members of the previous government who are currently in the Knesset, there would be a majority of 60 something, enough for a majority. Perhaps the sticking point would be Ram, which there's been a lot of accusations that they support terror, not necessarily against Mansour Abbas himself, the leader, but other members of the party. So that probably in a wartime would be more problematic, unlike a year and a half, 2 years ago, whenever it was. But certainly they would be very close to the necessary 61, even without Ram and without the ultra-Orthodox. The ultra-Orthodox, as I've said many, many times, give you stability. But there is a different feeling about the situation with the ultra-Orthodox. And so probably Gantz wouldn't be able to go as far as Bibi has, even if he wanted to, simply because of this feeling that they're not pulling their weight. So yes, that is a possibility. And as I said, that has been the rumors behind the scenes that Gantz has made the deal with the ultra-Orthodox. But again, if you bring in the ultra-Orthodox, maybe Liebman has to sit out because he has said in the past he won't sit with Shas or United Torah Judaism. Obviously, that can change if their policies change and their positions change. But Lieberman is more of a maximalist on the conscription issue. So that may be more unpalatable for the ultra-Orthodox. So it's a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. If we do go to elections, obviously we'd have to see the relative strength of each party to know whether a government could be put together, because obviously it would be a disaster if we had that situation we had a few years ago where after elections, no government was formed and we went to another election shortly afterwards.
All right, thank you. So we have a couple questions, both related to the recent activities with Iran and their high-ranking generals that were taken out. The first is from Burak Korkmaz, who asks, can you comment on Khamenei's words on Iranian retaliation against Israel? And to follow up, Merdad Konsari asks, what can Israel do to offset possible Iranian reprisals against prominent Jews outside Israel in Europe or in other places?
Well, I'll address the second question. Quite simply, Iran has been trying for a number of months. There's been a dozen, if not more, attempted attacks by Iran and its proxies in the West, in Latin America, in Europe, in Asia, elsewhere, against Jewish sites. But thankfully, none of them have been successful thus far. So they are trying, but there is a feeling that the Ayatollahs have to do a lot more. This was a real, a slap in the face. This was even perhaps even worse. Some are saying this is even worse than when Soleimani was killed, even though that was not necessarily attributed to Israel. But there is a feeling that Iran has to react accordingly, has to up the ante. And as I said, there are those who feel that Iran could respond in an unprecedented way, in a way that they simply haven't done before, perhaps even from Iranian territory itself. And Israel is obviously taking that extremely seriously, and that's why it's calling up a lot of reserves from the Air Force tonight. I don't think Israel will strike first, unless perhaps they know there's an imminent attack. But I think everyone, they say pilots are in their planes on the runways. We're on maximum alert at this point, certainly probably for the next few days. Let's not forget, within that, obviously we have the last, I think it's the last Friday of Ramadan as well. So there is great potential, to inflame the region. So we just have to see what Iran, how it reacts, and if Israel can stop it.
All right, thank you. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for this week's podcast. Thank you again, Ashley, for joining us today.
Thank you.
And for our viewers, please join us this Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for a podcast with Nicholas Crowley. And before we go, we would also like to remind our viewers and listeners of the Middle East Forum's upcoming policy conference celebrating our 30-year anniversary. It'll be taking place from May 13th through May 15th in Washington, D.C., and it will feature policy panels covering Israel victory, confronting Islamism, threats from Turkey and Iran, and much, much more. You can sign up on our website under the activities tab or by sending an email to events@meforum.org. We hope to see you all there. We thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you have a wonderful day.